The story of French colonial empire begins not with grand declarations or royal proclamations, but with the salt spray of the Atlantic and the desperate search for a passage to the riches of Asia. In 1534, Jacques Cartier stood on the deck of his ship La Grande Hermine, peering through the fog at what would become the foundation of one of history's most distinctive colonial empires. The morning mist clung to the waters of the St. Lawrence, and Cartier could not have imagined that this moment would launch 3 centuries of French expansion across 4 continents. Unlike the Spanish conquistadors who sought gold and glory through conquest, or the English who would later establish plantation colonies built on rigid separation from indigenous peoples, the French would forge an empire based on adaptation, cooperation, and the pursuit of fur rather than precious metals. The winds that carried Cartier's ships across the Atlantic were the same that had brought Columbus to the Caribbean 42 years earlier, yet they carried with them distinctly different dreams and ambitions. While Spanish explorers searched for El Dorado and fountains of youth, French navigators pursued more practical goals rooted in the economic realities of 16th century Europe. The growing demand for luxury goods from Asia, particularly spices and silks, had enriched Venice and other Mediterranean trading cities for centuries. France, positioned on the Atlantic periphery of this lucrative trade, desperately needed its own route to bypass the Ottoman Empire's control of traditional overland passages. Cartier's first voyage to the New World was driven by the same dream that motivated Columbus and countless other explorers: the elusive Northwest Passage to China and the Indies. King Francis I of France, watching enviously as Spanish treasure fleets returned laden with Aztec and Incan gold, commissioned this Breton navigator to find France's own route to Asian wealth. The king's court at Fontainebleau buzzed with stories of Spanish conquests, and Francis desperately needed his own source of New World riches to compete with his Habsburg rivals. The Italian wars had drained the royal treasury, and France required new sources of revenue to maintain its position as a European great power. What Cartier discovered instead was the St. Lawrence River, a waterway that would become the arterial highway of French North America. The river stretched inland farther than any European waterway, promising access to the heart of an unknown continent. As Cartier's ships sailed past the rocky shores of Newfoundland and into the gulf that bears the saint's name, the navigator recorded his impressions of a land that seemed both promising and forbidding. The forests stretched endlessly inland, populated by peoples whose languages and customs were utterly foreign to European understanding. His encounters with the Iroquoian peoples at Stadacona and Hochelaga, present-day Quebec City and Montreal, established patterns of interaction that would define French colonialism for centuries to come. Unlike Cortés's conquest of Tenochtitlan or Pizarro's destruction of the Inca Empire, Cartier's meetings with indigenous leaders involved careful diplomacy and mutual curiosity. Chief Donnacona of Stadacona welcomed the French visitors while maintaining clear boundaries about territorial rights and trading relationships. These early encounters revealed that successful European expansion in North America would require accommodation rather than conquest. The indigenous peoples Cartier encountered possessed sophisticated political systems, extensive trading networks, and detailed knowledge of continental geography that far exceeded European understanding. The Iroquoian settlements he visited were substantial communities with complex social hierarchies and economic relationships extending hundreds of miles inland. Hochelaga, situated on an island in the St. Lawrence where Montreal now stands, impressed Cartier with its defensive palisades, organized agriculture, and evidence of extensive trade connections with distant peoples. The French approach to indigenous relations differed markedly from their European rivals, where Spanish colonizers imposed encomienda systems that enslaved native populations, and where English settlers would eventually push indigenous peoples westward through warfare and land purchases. The French developed what historians call the middle ground, a space of cultural accommodation and mutual benefit. This philosophy emerged partly from necessity. French colonial populations remained small compared to their rivals, but also from a pragmatic understanding that cooperation yielded better results than conquest in the North American environment. The harsh realities of North American winters quickly taught French colonizers that European agricultural techniques and settlement patterns were inadequate for survival in this new environment. The first French attempts at permanent settlement, including Cartier's own efforts to establish colonies in the 1540s, failed because colonizers tried to recreate European society without adapting to local conditions. Indigenous peoples possessed centuries of accumulated knowledge about surviving Canadian winters, hunting techniques adapted to North American game, and agricultural methods suited to the short growing season. Samuel de Champlain, often called the father of New France, embodied this collaborative approach when he established Quebec in 1608. Unlike Jamestown, founded the previous year by the English as a commercial venture focused on finding gold, Quebec was conceived as a permanent settlement that would serve as the hub of a fur trading network stretching deep into the continental interior. Champlain had learned from earlier French failures, understanding that successful colonization required long-term commitment, careful planning, and most importantly, positive relationships with indigenous neighbors. Champlain's background as a geographer and cartographer gave him a unique perspective on colonial development. His detailed maps of the North American coast, based on extensive exploration voyages, revealed a deep appreciation for the complexity of the continent's geography and the strategic importance of controlling key waterways. The site he chose for Quebec, where the St. Lawrence River narrows between high bluffs, provided natural defensive advantages while maintaining access to the river highway that connected the Atlantic to the Great Lakes. The establishment of Quebec required careful negotiation with local indigenous groups who had used the area as a seasonal hunting and trading site for generations. Champlain understood that French success depended on gaining acceptance as legitimate participants in existing indigenous political and economic networks rather than attempting to impose European systems through force. His diplomatic skills, honed through years of exploration and interaction with diverse indigenous cultures, proved crucial in establishing the foundations of New France. Champlain understood that success in this harsh northern climate required indigenous knowledge and partnership. His decision to ally with the Huron Confederation against their Iroquois enemies was not merely diplomatic maneuvering. It was a strategic choice that would shape the geopolitics of North America for generations. The alliance system that emerged from these early relationships created a network of mutual obligations and shared interests that extended French influence far beyond their actual territorial control. The Huron Confederation represented one of the most sophisticated indigenous political systems in North America, uniting multiple related tribes under a complex system of councils and shared decision-making. Their territory, in what is now southern Ontario, controlled crucial portage routes between the Great Lakes and provided access to the rich fur-bearing regions of the Canadian Shield. By allying with the Huron, Champlain gained French access to this extensive trading network while accepting obligations to support Huron interests in their conflicts with rival indigenous groups. The decision to support the Huron against the Iroquois Confederacy had profound long-term consequences for French colonial development. The Iroquois, particularly the Mohawk Nation, controlled the crucial Hudson River Valley and maintained close trading relationships with Dutch and later English colonizers. French support for Huron raids against Iroquois villages created a cycle of warfare that would persist for over a century, ultimately drawing European colonial powers into indigenous conflicts that predated their arrival. The fur trade became the economic foundation of New France, creating a colonial system unlike any other in the Americas. While Spanish colonies extracted silver from mines worked by indigenous laborers, and English tobacco plantations relied on African slave labor, French colonies developed an economy based on the voluntary participation of indigenous hunters and trappers. The beaver pelt, soft and waterproof when processed, became Europe's most desired material for hat making. European fashion demanded beaver felt hats as symbols of prosperity and respectability, creating an insatiable market for North American furs. The transformation of beaver pelts into fashionable hats required complex processing techniques that had been perfected in European workshops over centuries. The dense undercoat of beaver fur could be felted into waterproof material that maintained its shape and appearance despite harsh weather conditions. This technical superiority over other materials made beaver felt hats essential accessories for European gentlemen. creating a luxury market that could absorb enormous quantities of North American furs at profitable prices. This demand created a transcontinental network of trade relationships that extended French influence far beyond their actual settlements. Indigenous hunters and trappers became essential partners in an economic system that stretched from the subarctic forests of Hudson Bay to the fashion workshops of Paris. The fur trade created mutual dependencies that bound French colonizers and indigenous peoples together in relationships that were simultaneously economic, political, and cultural. The seasonal rhythms of the fur trade shaped the development of French colonial society in fundamental ways. Spring brought flotillas of canoes loaded with furs from the interior, converging on Quebec and Montreal for the annual trading fairs that determined the economic health of the entire colony. These gatherings brought together French merchants, colonial officials, indigenous chiefs, and mixed-race intermediaries in complex negotiations that involved not only economic exchange, but also diplomatic relationships and military alliances. The coureurs de bois, literally runners of the woods, became the human embodiment of this distinctive French colonial approach. These French traders and explorers adopted indigenous ways of life, learning native languages, marrying into indigenous communities, and traveling by canoe through the vast network of lakes and rivers that connected the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. Men like Etienne Brabale and Pierre Radisson became cultural intermediaries, equally at home in Versailles and in Huron longhouses. Their ability to navigate both French and indigenous social systems made them invaluable agents of colonial expansion. Brabale's life exemplified the possibilities and dangers of cultural boundary crossing in colonial North America. Sent as a young man to live among the Huron and learn their language, he became so thoroughly integrated into indigenous society that he sometimes acted independently of French colonial interests. His intimate knowledge of Great Lakes geography and indigenous politics made him an invaluable guide for French exploration, yet his divided loyalties eventually led to his death at the hands of his adopted Huron kinsmen during a period of political upheaval. The coureurs de bois developed distinctive skills and knowledge that combined European and indigenous traditions. They learned to navigate by reading subtle signs in the landscape, to survive harsh winters using indigenous techniques, and to conduct diplomacy according to indigenous protocols while maintaining their connections to French colonial society. Their birch bark canoes, adopted from indigenous technology, could carry enormous loads through shallow waters and over portages where European boats would have been useless. Their mixed-race children, the Métis, would form a distinct cultural group that served as bridges between French and indigenous worlds. The emergence of Métis communities around French trading posts created unique societies that combined elements of both parent cultures while developing their own distinctive characteristics. Métis settlements became crucial links in the fur trade network, providing services and expertise that neither purely French nor purely indigenous communities could offer. Métis culture developed its own language, Michif, which combined French and Cree vocabulary and grammar in ways that reflected the dual heritage of its speakers. Métis communities maintained kinship connections with both French and indigenous relatives, creating extensive networks of mutual obligation and support that strengthened the entire fur trade system. Their knowledge of both European and indigenous legal and social systems made them natural mediators in disputes and negotiations. The Catholic Church, particularly the Jesuit order, played a crucial role in French colonial expansion, but again in ways that differed from Spanish or Portuguese missions. While Spanish missions often served as instruments of cultural destruction and forced labor, French Jesuit missionaries, though certainly intent on religious conversion, also served as ethnographers, linguists, and diplomatic agents. The Jesuits who arrived in New France brought with them extensive experience from missions in China, Japan, and South America, giving them a sophisticated understanding of cross-cultural communication. The Jesuit approach to missionary work emphasized learning indigenous languages and understanding native cultures as prerequisites for effective evangelization. Unlike Franciscan missions in Spanish territories, which sought to transform indigenous peoples into European-style Christians through forced cultural change, Jesuit missions attempted to find common ground between Christian and indigenous spiritual traditions. This approach required intensive study of indigenous beliefs and practices, producing detailed ethnographic records that remain valuable historical sources. The Jesuit relations, detailed annual reports sent back to France, provided Europeans with their most comprehensive understanding of indigenous cultures and the North American environment. These reports, published annually from 1632 to 1673, combined missionary accounts with detailed observations of indigenous politics, economics, and social organization. The relations became bestsellers in France, shaping European perceptions of North America and indigenous peoples for generations. Father Jean de Braye's detailed descriptions of Huron society revealed the complexity and sophistication of indigenous political systems to European readers who had previously viewed native peoples as primitive savages. His accounts of Huron councils, diplomatic protocols, and economic relationships demonstrated that indigenous societies possessed governmental institutions and social organizations that rivaled European systems in their complexity and effectiveness. Missionaries like Jean de Braye, who died as a martyr among the Huron, became symbols of French commitment to their indigenous allies. Braye's torture and death during an Iroquois raid on Huron villages in 1649 shocked French colonial society and reinforced their sense of shared destiny with their indigenous partners. The missionaries' martyrdom became a rallying cry for French resistance to Iroquois expansion and English encroachment on French territorial claims. The destruction of Huronia by Iroquois warriors between 1648 and 1650 represented a catastrophe for French colonial development that extended far beyond the loss of missionary lives. The dispersal of Huron survivors destroyed the trading network that had been the economic foundation of New France, forcing French colonizers to develop new relationships with other indigenous groups and to extend their own exploration and trading activities much farther into the continental interior. This commitment was tested repeatedly as French colonial ambitions expanded beyond the St. Lawrence Valley. The discovery of the Mississippi River by Louis Joliet and Jacques Marquette in 1673 opened the possibility of a continuous French empire stretching from the Arctic to the Gulf of Mexico. The two explorers, one a fur trader and the other a Jesuit missionary, embodied the dual motivations of French expansion, economic opportunity, and religious mission that distinguished French colonialism from purely commercial ventures. Marquette's missionary zeal and Joliet's commercial acumen complemented each other perfectly during their historic voyage down the Mississippi. Marquette saw the great river as a highway for carrying Christian evangelization to indigenous peoples throughout the continental interior, while Joliet recognized the enormous economic potential of controlling this crucial transportation route. Their detailed maps and reports of the expedition provided the geographical knowledge that would guide subsequent French expansion into the Mississippi Valley. The indigenous peoples they encountered along the Mississippi, including the Illinois Confederation and various tribes in what is now Arkansas and Louisiana, possessed their own complex political and economic systems that had been shaped by centuries of interaction with other indigenous groups. The French explorers learned that successful expansion into this region would require the same careful diplomacy and cultural accommodation that had characterized French relationships in the Great Lakes region. René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de La Salle, realized this vision when he navigated the entire length of the Mississippi in 1682, claiming the vast Louisiana territory for Louis XIV. La Salle's expedition represented the culmination of decades of French exploration and the fulfillment of dreams that had motivated French expansion since Cartier's first voyage. The ceremony at the mouth of the Mississippi, where La Salle claimed all lands drained by the river for France, created the legal foundation for French territorial claims that would persist for over a century. The strategic implications were enormous. A French empire controlling the two greatest river systems of North America could potentially contain English expansion to the Atlantic coastal plain. French control of the Mississippi and St. Lawrence rivers would create a vast inland empire that could dominate continental trade and prevent English colonizers from expanding beyond the Appalachian Mountains. This vision of strategic encirclement became a central element of French colonial policy and a major source of conflict with English territorial ambitions. However, Transforming these territorial claims into effective control required enormous investments in infrastructure, personnel, and military resources that strained French capabilities. The distances involved in administering an empire stretching from Quebec to New Orleans exceeded anything previously attempted by European colonizers. Communication between the extremities of French territory required months of dangerous travel through potentially hostile territory, making coordinated policy implementation extremely difficult. The establishment of Louisiana represented both the pinnacle of French territorial ambition and the beginning of serious imperial overstretch. Unlike the fur trading posts of the Great Lakes region, Louisiana required substantial investment in infrastructure, defense, and administration. The new territory encompassed a vast area with diverse climates, indigenous populations, and economic potentials that demanded different colonial strategies and administrative approaches. The lower Mississippi Valley presented environmental challenges that differed dramatically from the familiar landscapes of the St. Lawrence Valley and the Great Lakes region. The subtropical climate, annual flooding, and disease environment of Louisiana required new approaches to settlement and economic development. French colonizers had to learn new agricultural techniques, adapt to different indigenous cultures, and develop economic systems suited to the unique conditions of the Gulf Coast region. New Orleans, founded in 1718, became the crucial link between the river trade of the interior and the Atlantic commerce that connected New France to the broader French Empire. The city's location near the mouth of the Mississippi gave it strategic control over all trade flowing down the continent's greatest river system. However, the site chosen for New Orleans, on low-lying land subject to periodic flooding, reflected the environmental challenges that would plague French colonial development in Louisiana. The establishment of New Orleans required extensive cooperation with local indigenous groups, particularly the Choctaw Nation, whose territory surrounded the new settlement. French colonial officials learned to navigate the complex diplomatic protocols of southeastern indigenous politics, which differed significantly from the Great Lakes systems they had previously encountered. The Choctaw Alliance became crucial for French survival in Louisiana, providing military support against English expansion from the Carolinas and Spanish encroachment from Florida. However, maintaining this vast territory with limited population and resources would prove increasingly difficult as European conflicts spilled over into North America. The War of Spanish Succession, Queen Anne's War in North America, demonstrated the vulnerability of extended French territorial claims to English naval power and colonial military forces. French positions in Acadia, Hudson Bay, and Newfoundland came under sustained attack, revealing the difficulty of defending scattered territories with limited resources. French colonial society developed unique characteristics that reflected both the demands of the North American environment and the cultural values imported from France. The seigneurial system, transplanted from feudal France, created long, narrow farms stretching back from the St. Lawrence River, allowing maximum river frontage for transportation while creating a distinctive landscape pattern still visible in modern Quebec. This adaptation of European agricultural organization to North American conditions demonstrated the flexibility that characterized French colonial development. The seigneurial system in New France differed significantly from its European model, reflecting the realities of colonial life and the abundance of available land. Seigneurs, the landowners who received grants from the colonial government, had fewer rights and privileges than their European counterparts, while habitants, the tenant farmers, enjoyed greater independence and mobility. The chronic shortage of agricultural labor in New France meant that seigneurs had to offer attractive terms to attract and retain tenants. However, the harsh realities of colonial life modified Old World social hierarchies. Habitants, the French colonial farmers, enjoyed greater independence than their European counterparts, while the constant need for military service against indigenous enemies and English rivals created a more egalitarian society than existed in metropolitan France. The frontier environment rewarded practical skills and personal initiative over inherited social status, creating opportunities for social mobility that were rare in European society. The militia system that developed in New France reflected these egalitarian tendencies while meeting the practical needs of colonial defense. All male colonists between the ages of 16 and 60 were required to serve in the militia, creating a citizen army that could respond quickly to threats from any direction. This system produced colonial soldiers who combined European military training with indigenous fighting techniques, creating a uniquely effective fighting force adapted to North American conditions. The role of women in New France also differed significantly from other colonial societies. The filles du roi, young women sent to New France as brides for colonists, often enjoyed greater legal and economic rights than women in France itself. The colonial legal system, while based on French law, adapted to local conditions in ways that often favored women's rights to property ownership and business participation. The shortage of European women in the early colonial period meant that those who did immigrate could often negotiate favorable marriage contracts and business arrangements. The shortage of European women meant that intermarriage with indigenous women was common and socially accepted, creating extended kinship networks that strengthened French alliances with native peoples. These marriages, often formalized according to indigenous customs rather than European legal requirements, created family connections that transcended cultural boundaries and provided French traders and officials with crucial access to indigenous communities and knowledge systems. Women like Madeleine de Vercherez, who defended her family's fort against Iroquois' attack, became symbols of colonial resilience and adaptation. Her successful defense of Fort Vercherez in 1692, when she was only 14 years old, demonstrated the ways that colonial life required women to take on roles and responsibilities that would have been unthinkable in European society. These frontier heroines became central figures in the developing mythology of French-Canadian identity. The economic roles available to women in New France extended far beyond those typically found in European society. Women operated businesses, owned property, and participated in the fur trade in ways that reflected both the opportunities created by colonial conditions and the practical necessities of survival in a harsh environment. The legal system of New France, based on the custom of Paris, provided women with property rights and legal protections that were often superior to those available in other colonial societies. French expansion into the Caribbean introduced different dynamics and challenges to their colonial empire. The establishment of sugar plantations on islands like Martinique, Guadeloupe, and Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, created colonial societies based on African slave labor rather than indigenous partnership. The wealth generated by Caribbean sugar far exceeded the profits from the North American fur trade, making these tropical colonies the economic jewels of the French Empire. The Caribbean colonies represented a fundamental departure from the cooperative colonial model that had developed in North America. The plantation system required large-scale importation of enslaved African laborers and created rigid social hierarchies based on race and legal status. The environmental conditions of the tropical islands, with their year-round growing seasons and ideal conditions for sugar cultivation, made possible levels of agricultural production and profitability that were impossible in the northern climate of New France. The development of sugar plantation agriculture in the French Caribbean followed models established by earlier Portuguese and Spanish colonizers in Brazil and the Spanish Caribbean. However, French planners adapted these systems to local conditions and developed new techniques for sugar processing and plantation management. The wealth generated by Caribbean sugar production financed French military operations in Europe and provided the economic foundation for France's emergence as a major European power. However, the plantation system created social tensions and contradictions that would eventually contribute to imperial instability. The concentration of enormous numbers of enslaved Africans on relatively small islands created constant fears of rebellion and required extensive military forces to maintain order. The brutal conditions of plantation labor and the high mortality rates among enslaved workers created a system that required continuous importation of new slaves to maintain production levels. The sugar colonies required massive importation of enslaved Africans to work the plantations under brutal conditions. The Code Noir, promulgated by Louis XIV in 1685, attempted to regulate slavery throughout the French Empire, but its provisions were often ignored by plantation owners focused on maximizing profits. The legal framework created by the Code Noir established the parameters of slavery in French colonies, while attempting to balance the interests of slave owners with minimal protections for enslaved people. The Code Noir represented an attempt to create a comprehensive legal framework for slavery that would standardize practices across the French Empire while maintaining social order and maximizing economic productivity. The code required slave owners to provide basic food and clothing for their enslaved workers, prohibited the most extreme forms of physical abuse, and established procedures for manumission. However, enforcement of these provisions was largely left to colonial officials who were often closely connected to plantation interests. The wealth flowing from Caribbean sugar financed French military operations in Europe and North America, but it also created a colonial society fundamentally different from the cooperative relationships that characterized New France. The enormous profits generated by sugar plantations created a planter class whose wealth rivaled that of European nobility, while the mass of enslaved workers lived in conditions of extreme deprivation and brutality. Saint-Domingue became the most profitable colony in the Americas, producing more wealth than all of Spanish America combined by the mid-18th century. The colony's sugar and coffee plantations generated enormous revenues that flowed back to France, financing the wars and diplomatic initiatives that maintained France's position as a European great power. The prosperity of Saint-Domingue became a symbol of French colonial success and a crucial component of French national wealth. The capital, Port-au-Prince, rivaled any European city in luxury and sophistication, built on the labor of hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans. The wealth of Saint-Domingue's planters allowed them to create a colonial society that mimicked European aristocratic culture, while being fundamentally dependent on the most brutal forms of human exploitation. The contradiction between the refined culture of the planter class and the horrific conditions of plantation slavery created social tensions that would eventually explode in revolutionary violence. However, this wealth came at an enormous human cost, and the contradictions inherent in a slave society would eventually explode in the Haitian Revolution, the first successful slave revolt in history. The revolution that began in 1791 would destroy the wealthiest colony in the Americas and create the first independent nation founded by former slaves, demonstrating the ultimate unsustainability of colonial systems based on extreme exploitation. The French also established trading posts along the African coast, particularly in Senegal, to supply enslaved people to their Caribbean plantations. These West African settlements represented another dimension of French colonialism, focused on commercial extraction rather than territorial control or cultural accommodation. The French presence in West Africa was limited to fortified trading posts that served as collection points for the Atlantic slave trade, requiring cooperation with African political authorities and merchant networks. The Royal Company of Senegal, chartered in 1696, established fortified trading posts that served as collection points for the Atlantic slave trade, connecting French colonial ambitions in the Caribbean to the complex political and economic networks of West Africa. French traders learned to navigate African political systems and commercial practices, developing relationships with local rulers and merchants that were essential for successful slave trading operations. The African dimension of French colonialism required different strategies and approaches than those developed in North America or the Caribbean. French traders operated as minorities within established African political and economic systems, requiring diplomatic skills and cultural sensitivity to maintain profitable trading relationships. The success of French slave trading operations depended on their ability to work within existing African networks, rather than imposing European systems through force. French involvement in India added yet another layer to their expanding global empire. The French East India Company, established in 1664 to compete with its Dutch and English counterparts, established trading posts at Pondicherry, Chandernagore, and other locations along the Indian coast. The company's operations in India represented French attempts to participate in the enormously profitable Asian trade that had enriched European nations for over a century. The French East India Company faced significant challenges in competing with established Dutch and English trading networks that had been operating in Asian waters for decades. The company's late entry into Asian markets meant that the most profitable trading opportunities had already been secured by competitors, forcing French traders to develop new strategies and find alternative sources of profit in the complex world of Indian Ocean commerce. Under the leadership of Joseph François Dupleix, the French pursued an ambitious strategy of territorial expansion and political intervention in the complex world of 18th-century Indian politics. Dupleix recognized that successful European expansion in India required understanding and manipulating the intricate political relationships between various Indian princes, the declining Mughal Empire, and emerging regional powers like the Marathas and the Nizam of Hyderabad. Dupleix's approach in India mirrored French colonial strategies elsewhere, emphasizing alliance building and cultural accommodation rather than direct conquest. French officers trained Indian armies in European military techniques while adopting Indian administrative practices and diplomatic protocols. This strategy of cultural adaptation and political alliance reflected the same pragmatic approach that had characterized French expansion in North America, demonstrating the consistency of French colonial methods across different environments and cultures. The French allied with various Indian princes against British expansion, creating a network of client states that extended French influence far beyond their actual territorial holdings. These alliances required French officials to understand the complex honor codes and diplomatic protocols that governed relationships between Indian rulers, while providing military and technical assistance that enhanced their allies' capabilities against common enemies. French military advisors in India, like their counterparts among indigenous peoples in North America, learned to combine European military technology and tactics with local knowledge and fighting methods. The sepoy armies trained by French officers became formidable fighting forces that could challenge British expansion while maintaining their connections to Indian political and social systems. The competition between France and Britain in India became part of a global struggle for imperial dominance that would ultimately determine the fate of French colonial ambitions. The rivalry between Dupleix and Robert Clive, his British counterpart, represented more than personal ambition. It embodied two different visions of European expansion in Asia. The French approach, based on integration and alliance, competed with the British strategy of commercial dominance backed by superior naval power. The global nature of Franco-British competition meant that events in India influenced developments in North America and the Caribbean, while European wars shaped the possibilities for colonial expansion in Asia. The interconnected nature of 18th-century imperial competition created a world system in which local conflicts in one region could have profound consequences for colonial development thousands of miles away. By the early 18th century, the French Empire had achieved remarkable geographical scope. Stretching from the frozen shores of Hudson Bay to the tropical plantations of the Caribbean, from the trading posts of West Africa to the princely courts of South India. This vast empire was held together not by overwhelming military force or massive population transfers, but by networks of alliance, trade, and cultural accommodation that reflected distinctively French approaches to colonialism. The diversity of French colonial territories required different administrative approaches, and colonial strategies adapted to local conditions and cultures. The fur trading posts of the Great Lakes region operated according to different principles than the sugar plantations of the Caribbean, while the trading factories of India required yet another set of diplomatic and commercial skills. This diversity demonstrated both the flexibility of French colonial methods and the challenges of maintaining imperial unity across such varied territories. However, this far-flung empire also revealed fundamental weaknesses that would become apparent during the great global conflicts of the mid-18th century. French colonial territories were often isolated from each other and from metropolitan France, dependent on sea lanes that could be disrupted by superior British naval power. The small French colonial populations, while creating less social tension than in other empires, also meant fewer resources for defense during wartime. The unique character of French colonialism, with its emphasis on cooperation and accommodation, created both strengths and vulnerabilities. In North America, French alliances with indigenous peoples provided military advantages and economic opportunities that English colonists could not match. French traders and explorers could travel safely through vast territories where English settlers faced constant warfare. However, these same alliances created obligations and commitments that stretched French resources and complicated diplomatic relationships. The 7 Years' War, beginning in 1756, would test whether the French colonial system could survive sustained conflict with British imperial power. The war represented the first truly global conflict in human history, with battles fought simultaneously in Europe, North America, the Caribbean, India, and the Philippines. For France, it became a struggle for imperial survival as British naval supremacy threatened to sever the connections that held the French Empire together. The global scope of the 7 Years' War reflected the extent to which European imperial competition had created interconnected colonial systems that spanned multiple continents. The war that began with frontier skirmishes in the Ohio Valley eventually involved every major European power and was fought in locations as distant as the Philippines and the coast of West Africa. This global conflict would determine not only the fate of French colonial ambitions, but also the future structure of European imperial competition. The conflict began in the Ohio Valley, where French and British territorial claims overlapped and where indigenous peoples found themselves caught between competing European powers. The young George Washington's defeat at Fort Necessity in 1754 marked the beginning of hostilities that would eventually engulf the world. For France, the challenge was maintaining communication and supply lines across vast distances while fighting a technologically advanced enemy with superior naval resources. The Ohio Valley conflict reflected the broader struggle between French and British colonial systems in North America. French claims to the region were based on exploration and indigenous alliances, while British claims rested on colonial charters and the westward expansion of existing settlements. The competing colonial philosophies that had shaped French and British expansion came into direct conflict in the disputed territories of the Trans-Appalachian West. French military strategy relied heavily on indigenous allies who provided knowledge of local terrain, guerrilla warfare tactics, and manpower that European troops could not match. The success of French forces under the Marquis de Montcalm at Fort Carillon demonstrated the effectiveness of this combined approach as French regulars, Canadian militia, and indigenous warriors defeated a much larger British force through superior tactics and terrain knowledge. The Battle of Fort Carillon in 1758 became a symbol of French military effectiveness and the power of Franco-indigenous cooperation in North American warfare. Montcalm's victory over a British force more than 3 times larger than his own demonstrated that European military superiority was not inevitable in North American conditions. The combination of French military engineering, Canadian knowledge of wilderness warfare, and indigenous tactical expertise created a formidable defensive capability. However, the fundamental strategic disadvantage of French colonial positions became increasingly apparent as the war progressed. British control of the Atlantic meant that French reinforcements and supplies reached North America sporadically, while British forces could be reinforced and resupplied continuously. The fall of Louisbourg in 1758 severed the connection between France and New France, leaving the colony isolated and vulnerable. The siege of Louisbourg demonstrated the decisive importance of naval power in 18th-century imperial warfare. The fortress, considered impregnable by French military engineers, fell to British forces supported by overwhelming naval superiority that prevented French relief expeditions from reaching the besieged garrison. The loss of Louisbourg exposed the St. Lawrence River to British naval attack and made the defense of Quebec virtually impossible. The Plains of Abraham, where Montcalm and British General James Wolfe both died in 1759, represented more than a military defeat for France. It symbolized the collapse of a colonial system that had seemed to offer an alternative to the harsh exploitation that characterized other European empires. The death of Montcalm, fighting alongside Canadian militia and indigenous warriors, embodied the cooperative spirit that had defined French colonialism in North America. The battle itself lasted only minutes, but its consequences shaped the future of North America for centuries. Wolfe's successful assault on the supposedly impregnable heights above Quebec City demonstrated that French defensive advantages could be overcome by superior resources and tactical innovation. The deaths of both commanding generals in the moment of victory and defeat added tragic drama to what was already a historically decisive encounter. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 formally ended French colonial dominance in North America, ceding Canada to Britain and Louisiana to Spain rather than allow it to fall into British hands. However, the end of New France did not mean the end of French colonial ambitions. The loss of North America would eventually lead to renewed French expansion in other parts of the world, as successive French governments sought to rebuild their global empire and restore their international prestige. The treaty negotiations revealed the relative value that European powers placed on different colonial territories. France chose to retain the Caribbean sugar islands of Martinique and Guadeloupe rather than recover Canada, demonstrating that tropical plantation colonies were considered more valuable than the fur trading territories of North America. This decision reflected the economic realities of 18th-century colonialism while abandoning the French colonists and indigenous allies who had built New France. The legacy of early French colonialism extended far beyond the territories that remained under French control after 1763. The distinctive approaches to indigenous relations, cultural accommodation, and economic partnership that characterized French colonial policy would influence subsequent European expansion and provide alternative models for colonial development. The Métis communities of the Great Lakes region, the Creole cultures of Louisiana, and the complex ethnic hierarchies of the Caribbean all reflected the unique characteristics of French colonial society. French colonial influence persisted in North America long after the formal end of French political control. The legal systems of Quebec and Louisiana retained French characteristics, while French language and culture continued to shape regional development. Indigenous communities that had been allied with France maintained distinct identities and political traditions that reflected centuries of Franco-Indigenous cooperation and cultural exchange. Moreover, the French colonial experience demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of empire building in the early modern period. The French success in creating extensive networks of alliance and trade across vast territories showed that colonial empires did not necessarily require massive population transfers or overwhelming military force. However, the ultimate failure of French colonial ambitions in the face of British naval power also revealed the importance of sea power and economic resources in sustaining global empires. The lessons learned from the rise and fall of the first French colonial empire would influence subsequent French imperial expansion in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. The emphasis on cultural accommodation, indigenous alliance, and economic partnership that had characterized French colonialism in North America would be adapted to new environments and different challenges as France sought to rebuild its global empire in the 19th and 20th centuries. The rise of French colonial empire from 1534 to 1763 represented one of the most distinctive experiments in European expansion. Unlike Spanish conquistadors or English plantation owners, French colonizers developed systems of cooperation and accommodation that created unique colonial societies. The Coureurs de Bois paddling through the Great Lakes, the sugar planters of Saint-Domingue, the Jesuit missionaries among the Huron, and the French officers training Indian armies all participated in a colonial enterprise that sought profit and power through partnership rather than domination. This first phase of French imperial history established patterns and precedents that would influence French colonial policy for centuries to come. The emphasis on cultural accommodation, the reliance on indigenous allies, the integration of mixed-race populations, and the creation of distinctive colonial societies all became hallmarks of French colonialism. Even as France lost its North American empire, these approaches would be adapted and modified as France built new colonial territories in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. The story of early French colonialism thus represents both a remarkable achievement and a cautionary tale about the complexities of empire building. The French created a global network of colonies and trading posts that stretched across 4 continents, held together by relationships of mutual benefit rather than simple exploitation. However, this same system proved vulnerable to the superior resources and naval power of their British rivals, leading to the collapse of French colonial dominance in the crucial 7 Years' War. as French colonial ambitions shifted from the lost territories of North America to new opportunities in Africa and Asia. The lessons learned from the rise and fall of New France would continue to influence French imperial policy. The distinctive character of French colonialism, forged in the forests of North America and the sugar islands of the Caribbean, would be adapted to new environments and new challenges as France sought to rebuild its global empire and restore its position as a world power. The legacy of this first great age of French expansion would echo through the centuries, shaping not only French colonial policy, but also the development of the modern world system that emerged from the competition between European imperial powers. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 marked not merely the end of a war, but the beginning of a profound transformation in French imperial ambitions that would reshape the entire trajectory of French colonial history. As French negotiators signed away vast territories in North America and India, surrendering Canada, Louisiana, and most of their Indian trading posts to British control, they could hardly have imagined that within a generation, revolution would sweep away the entire political system that had built France's first global empire. The loss of New France, with its fur trading networks stretching from Quebec to the Great Lakes, and the reduction of French holdings in India to a handful of trading posts, created a crisis of confidence that would ultimately contribute to the revolutionary upheaval that began in 1789. The immediate aftermath of the 7 Years' War saw France struggling to rebuild its finances and restore its international prestige in a world where British naval supremacy had fundamentally altered the balance of global power. The enormous costs of the conflict, which had consumed nearly 2 billion livres and pushed the French treasury to the brink of bankruptcy, while the loss of lucrative colonial territories eliminated crucial sources of revenue that had previously sustained French commerce and industry. The fur trade of Canada, the sugar plantations of Louisiana, and the textile exports from Indian factories had all contributed significantly to French prosperity before the war. Their sudden disappearance left gaping holes in the French economy that would prove impossible to fill through European trade alone. Sugar production in the remaining Caribbean colonies of Martinique, Guadeloupe, and Saint-Domingue became even more vital to French economic survival in this dramatically altered imperial landscape. The profits from these islands, built on the brutal exploitation of enslaved African labor transported across the Atlantic in horrific conditions, provided one of the few bright spots in an otherwise grim colonial balance sheet. French merchants in Bordeaux, Nantes, and Le Havre had invested heavily in the slave trade and sugar refining industries, creating complex financial networks that depended entirely on Caribbean production for their continued profitability. Saint-Domingue, in particular, emerged as the jewel of what remained of the French colonial empire, a tropical territory that would become the most profitable colony in the entire Caribbean region. By the 1770s, this single colony was producing more sugar than all the British Caribbean islands combined, generating enormous wealth that flowed back to metropolitan France through an intricate web of commercial relationships. The wealth generated by Saint-Domingue's plantations, worked by hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans under conditions of unimaginable brutality, flowed back to France, enriching merchants in Bordeaux, Nantes, and Le Havre while supporting a complex network of refineries, shipping companies, and financial institutions that employed thousands of French workers. The colony's prosperity seemed to demonstrate that France could rebuild its imperial fortunes even after the disasters of the 7 Years' War, offering hope that colonial profits could compensate for territorial losses. However, the social structure of Saint-Domingue contained the seeds of its own destruction, creating tensions that would ultimately explode into the most successful slave rebellion in human history. The colony's population included approximately 40,000 white colonists, 30,000 free people of color, and nearly 500,000 enslaved Africans, creating a demographic powder keg that required constant vigilance to maintain. This demographic imbalance created constant tensions that were exacerbated by the complex racial hierarchies that governed colonial society, with elaborate legal codes that defined the rights and restrictions applicable to each racial category. Free people of color, many of whom were wealthy planters and merchants in their own right who owned substantial properties, and enslaved people, faced increasing discrimination from white colonists who feared their growing economic and political influence and sought to maintain their own privileged position through increasingly restrictive legislation. The outbreak of revolution in France in 1789 sent shockwaves throughout the French colonial empire, creating unprecedented challenges to established authority and traditional social hierarchies. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen proclaimed that all men were born free and equal, raising fundamental questions about the continuation of slavery in French colonies and challenging the entire legal and social foundation of colonial society. In Saint-Domingue, these revolutionary ideals sparked conflicts between white colonists who wanted greater autonomy from metropolitan control while maintaining their economic privileges, free people of color who demanded equal rights and political representation, and enslaved people who saw an opportunity to claim their freedom and overturn the entire colonial system. The situation in Saint-Domingue deteriorated rapidly as different groups attempted to exploit the revolutionary chaos for their own purposes, creating a complex, multi-sided conflict that would eventually consume the entire colony. White colonists initially welcomed the revolution as an opportunity to gain greater control over colonial affairs and reduce interference from metropolitan administrators, but they had no intention of extending revolutionary principles to the enslaved population or sharing political power with free people of color. Free people of color, led by figures like Vincent Auger, who had been educated in France and exposed to Enlightenment ideas about natural rights, demanded the political rights that revolutionary ideology seemed to promise, organizing political clubs and petitioning campaigns that challenged white supremacy. When their peaceful petitions were rejected and Vincent Auger was brutally executed for his political activities, some free people of color turned to armed resistance, creating alliances with enslaved people who shared their opposition to white colonial rule. The enslaved population of Saint-Domingue watched these conflicts with growing awareness that the revolutionary moment offered unprecedented opportunities for liberation, as traditional authorities were weakened and competing groups sought their support. In August 1791, a massive slave uprising began in the northern province of the colony, sparked by a voodoo ceremony at Bois Caraman where enslaved leaders swore to fight for their freedom. Led by Toussaint Louverture, a former enslaved person who had taught himself to read and write and possessed remarkable military and political skills, along with Jean-Jacques Dessalines, Henry Christophe, and other remarkable leaders who emerged from the enslaved population, the rebellion quickly spread across the colony. What began as a slave revolt evolved into a complex revolutionary war that would ultimately destroy French control over the most profitable colony in the Caribbean, challenging fundamental assumptions about race, slavery, and colonial rule that had sustained European empires for centuries. The Haitian Revolution, as this uprising came to be known, represented a fundamental challenge to the entire system of European colonialism and the racial ideologies that justified it. For the first time in history, enslaved people had successfully overthrown their masters and established an independent nation, proving that enslaved Africans were capable of military organization, political leadership, and effective governance. The revolution's leaders explicitly connected their struggle to the broader ideals of the French Revolution, arguing that true liberty and equality could not coexist with slavery and colonial domination, and that the principles proclaimed in Paris must be applied universally or they were meaningless. The French response to the Haitian Revolution revealed the contradictions at the heart of revolutionary ideology and the limits of Enlightenment thinking about human rights. While proclaiming universal human rights in Europe and celebrating the overthrow of aristocratic privilege, French leaders struggled to accept the implications of these principles for their colonial empire, where racial slavery generated enormous profits. The National Convention briefly abolished slavery in 1794, but this decision was driven more by military necessity than moral conviction, as French officials hoped that the promise of freedom would convince formerly enslaved people to fight against British and Spanish forces that were attempting to seize French colonial territories during the European War. Napoleon Bonaparte's rise to power marked a decisive shift in French colonial policy, toward a more pragmatic and authoritarian approach that prioritized economic interests over revolutionary ideals. The ambitious general had little sympathy for revolutionary ideals when they conflicted with imperial interests or threatened French prosperity, viewing the abolition of slavery as a dangerous precedent that undermined colonial profitability. In 1802, Napoleon dispatched a massive military expedition to Saint-Domingue under the command of his brother-in-law, General Charles Leclerc, with orders to restore French authority and eliminate the black leadership that had emerged during the Revolution. The expedition's secret orders included the restoration of slavery and the elimination of the black and mixed-race leadership that had emerged during the Revolution, revealing Napoleon's determination to restore the old colonial order regardless of the human costs. The French expedition initially achieved considerable success, capturing key ports and forcing Toussaint Louverture to surrender through a combination of military pressure and false promises of negotiation. However, the campaign soon became a disaster of epic proportions as yellow fever decimated French forces, while the local population waged a fierce guerrilla war against the occupying army. Leclerc himself died of disease along with thousands of his soldiers, and his successor, General Rochambeau, resorted to increasingly brutal tactics, including the use of attack dogs and mass executions that only strengthened resistance to French rule. The French forces, despite their superior equipment and training, found themselves unable to control the interior of the island, where former enslaved people had established fortified camps and developed effective military tactics suited to the tropical environment. The final phase of the Haitian Revolution coincided with the renewal of war between France and Britain in Europe, creating impossible strategic pressures for Napoleon's government. Napoleon, facing the prospect of a prolonged and costly campaign in the Caribbean, while simultaneously fighting a European coalition that threatened France's continental position, made the pragmatic decision to cut his losses and focus French resources on European conquest. The French evacuation of Saint-Domingue in 1803 paved the way for the declaration of Haitian independence on January 1, 1804, creating the world's first black republic and the second independent nation in the Americas. The loss of Saint-Domingue was a catastrophic blow to French imperial ambitions that eliminated France's most profitable colonial territory and demonstrated the vulnerability of European colonial rule. The colony had been the most profitable territory in the French Empire, generating enormous revenues that supported French commerce and industry while providing employment for thousands of French workers in related industries. Its loss eliminated a crucial source of wealth, just as Napoleon was attempting to finance his ambitious plans for European domination, forcing him to seek alternative sources of revenue through continental conquest and the exploitation of European territories. The failure of the Saint-Domingue expedition also demonstrated the limits of military power when confronted with determined popular resistance and hostile environmental conditions, lessons that would prove relevant for later colonial campaigns. European diseases like yellow fever, which had devastating effects on European troops unaccustomed to tropical conditions, proved to be powerful allies of the independence movement, while the guerrilla tactics developed by former enslaved people showed how local knowledge and determination could overcome superior European military technology. Napoleon's response to these colonial setbacks was characteristically bold and pragmatic, reflecting his willingness to abandon unsuccessful policies in favor of more promising alternatives, recognizing that France lacked the naval power to maintain a global empire while fighting Britain, whose naval supremacy made it impossible to protect distant colonial territories. He decided to focus French resources on European conquest, where French military advantages were more decisive. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803, in which Napoleon sold the vast Louisiana territory to the United States for $15 million, reflected the strategic reorientation toward continental rather than overseas expansion. Rather than attempting to defend distant territories that were vulnerable to British naval attack and required enormous resources to maintain, Napoleon concentrated on building a European empire that could be controlled from Paris through direct military occupation. This decision had profound implications for the future development of both France and the United States, as it eliminated French presence from North America while providing the United States with the territorial base for its subsequent expansion across the continent. The Napoleonic Wars fundamentally reshaped the global balance of power and set the stage for a new phase of French imperial expansion that would emerge after Napoleon's defeat. While Napoleon's armies conquered much of Europe, creating a continental empire that stretched from Spain to Poland, British naval supremacy ensured that most remaining French colonies fell under British control during the prolonged conflict. Martinique, Guadeloupe, French Guiana, and the Indian Ocean islands of Mauritius and Réunion all experienced British occupation at various points during the Napoleonic period, disrupting colonial trade and administration. The experience of British rule during the Napoleonic Wars had profound effects on French colonial societies that would influence their subsequent development under restored French control. In many cases, British administrators introduced new legal systems, economic policies, and social arrangements that persisted even after territories were returned to French control, creating hybrid colonial institutions that combined French and British practices. The temporary separation from France also fostered the development of distinct colonial identities and interests that would complicate efforts to restore effective metropolitan control, as colonial populations had experienced alternative forms of governance and developed new expectations about their rights and status. The restoration of the Bourbon monarchy in 1814 and 1815 marked the beginning of a new chapter in French colonial history that would eventually lead to the creation of the Second French Colonial Empire. The restored monarchy inherited a much reduced colonial empire that bore little resemblance to the global network of territories that had existed before the 7 Years' War, consisting mainly of a few Caribbean islands, some trading posts in India, and scattered settlements in Africa and the Pacific. Apart from a few Caribbean islands, some trading posts in India, and a handful of settlements in Africa, France had lost most of its overseas territories to British conquest or successful independence movements. The challenge facing French colonial administrators after 1815 was how to rebuild imperial power in a world that had been fundamentally transformed by revolution and war, where new ideas about national self-determination and human rights challenged traditional colonial relationships. The successful slave rebellion in Haiti had demonstrated that colonial populations could not be taken for granted, while the growth of British naval and commercial power had created new competitive pressures that made it difficult for France to establish secure colonial territories. At the same time, the Industrial Revolution was beginning to transform European economies in ways that would have profound implications for colonial relationships, creating new demands for raw materials and markets that would drive renewed imperial expansion. The French conquest of Algeria beginning in 1830 represented the first major step in the creation of what historians call the Second French Colonial Empire, marking France's return to large-scale imperial expansion after the setbacks of the Napoleonic period. The decision to invade Algeria was initially driven by domestic political considerations rather than a coherent imperial strategy, as King Charles X hoped that a successful military campaign would restore the prestige of the Bourbon monarchy and distract attention from growing political opposition at home. The invasion also reflected French desires to eliminate the Barbary corsairs who had long disrupted Mediterranean commerce and to establish French influence in North Africa as a counterweight to British power in the region. The invasion of Algeria began with a relatively modest expedition aimed at punishing the Dey of Algiers for alleged insults to French honor, specifically his striking of the French consul with a fly whisk during a diplomatic dispute over unpaid debts. However, what started as a limited military intervention quickly evolved into a full-scale conquest and colonization project that would consume enormous French resources over several decades. French forces captured Algiers in July 1830, but they soon discovered that controlling the coastal cities was far easier than subduing the interior regions where Arab and Berber tribes maintained fierce resistance to foreign occupation. The conquest of Algeria proved to be a far more difficult and costly undertaking than French planners had anticipated, requiring the deployment of hundreds of thousands of troops over many years. Abd al-Qadir, a charismatic religious and political leader who combined Islamic scholarship with military genius, organized a sophisticated resistance movement that employed guerrilla tactics to harass French forces and prevent the establishment of effective colonial control. His forces used their knowledge of local terrain and climate to maximum advantage, striking French convoys and outposts before disappearing into the desert or mountains where European troops found it difficult to follow. The French response involved increasingly brutal military campaigns that devastated the Algerian countryside and displaced hundreds of thousands of people from their homes in what amounted to a war of extermination against civilian populations. French commanders like Thomas Bugeaud developed new tactics specifically designed to break the will of the Algerian population, including the systematic destruction of crops and livestock, the poisoning of wells, and the forced relocation of entire tribes to concentration camps where many died from disease and starvation. The Algerian conquest coincided with the July Revolution of 1830, which brought Louis Philippe and the July monarchy to power in France, creating political complications for the colonial project. The new regime inherited the Algerian commitment and gradually expanded French objectives from limited coastal occupation to complete territorial control, driven partly by the logic of military necessity and partly by growing colonial lobby that saw Algeria as the foundation for French regeneration. This expansion was driven partly by military logic, as French commanders argued that effective control of the coast required domination of the interior, and partly by the growing influence of colonial advocates who saw Algeria as the foundation for a new French empire in Africa that would restore French greatness. The process of pacifying Algeria took decades and involved some of the most brutal military campaigns in the history of European colonialism, campaigns that shocked even contemporary observers accustomed to colonial violence. French generals like Thomas Bugeaud employed tactics of total war that targeted civilian populations as well as military forces, arguing that the destruction of the economic and social foundations of Algerian society was necessary to break resistance. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, and entire populations forced to relocate in efforts to break the resistance movement, while French forces employed new technologies like improved firearms and telegraph communications to coordinate their campaigns. These methods eventually succeeded in establishing French control, but they left a legacy of bitterness that would influence Franco-Algerian relations for more than a century and create deep divisions within French society about the morality of colonial conquest. The brutality of the Algerian conquest sparked intense debates in France about the compatibility of republican values with colonial expansion, while the enormous costs of the campaign strained French finances and diverted resources from domestic development projects. The establishment of French rule in Algeria also involved extensive experiments in colonial governance and settlement that would serve as models for later French colonial projects. Unlike the commercial colonies of the 18th century, Algeria was envisioned as a settler colony where European colonists would establish permanent communities and transform the territory into an extension of France itself, creating a new France across the Mediterranean. The colonial administration encouraged European immigration through land grants and other incentives, leading to the establishment of a substantial settler population that would play a crucial role in Algerian politics for more than a century. The development of Algeria as a settler colony created unique challenges for French colonial policy that would persist throughout the colonial period. The European colonists, known as Pieds Noirs, developed their own economic and political interests that sometimes conflicted with metropolitan policies, particularly regarding the treatment of the indigenous population and the pace of political reform. At the same time, the indigenous Arab and Berber populations were subjected to discriminatory laws and policies that excluded them from full participation in colonial society, while exploiting their labor and resources through various forms of forced labor and taxation. The success of the Algerian conquest encouraged French expansion elsewhere in Africa and Asia, as French leaders gained confidence in their ability to establish and maintain colonial control through military force. During the 1840s and 1850s, French forces established protectorates in Tahiti and New Caledonia, expanded their presence in Senegal, and began the process of conquering Indochina, creating the foundation for what would become the world's second-largest colonial empire. These new colonial ventures reflected a growing confidence in French military capabilities and a renewed belief in the benefits of imperial expansion for French prosperity and prestige. The conquest of Indochina began with French intervention in Vietnam during the 1840s and 1850s. Initially motivated by the persecution of French missionaries and the desire to establish French influence in Southeast Asia as a counterweight to British expansion in the region. French missionaries and merchants had maintained a presence in Vietnam for centuries, but political instability and periodic persecution of Christians provided pretexts for military intervention that would gradually expand into full-scale conquest. The French gradually expanded their control from initial footholds in the south to encompass all of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos in what became known as French Indochina, creating a colonial federation that would persist until the 1950s. The establishment of French rule in Indochina followed patterns that had been developed in Algeria, but with important modifications reflecting local conditions and French colonial experience gained through previous conquests. The French employed a combination of direct administration and indirect rule through traditional monarchs and local elites, allowing them to maintain control with relatively small numbers of European administrators while preserving some elements of traditional political structures that could be used to legitimize colonial rule. This approach proved more flexible and cost-effective than the direct military occupation employed in Algeria, though it also created complex relationships between French administrators, traditional rulers, and local populations. The economic development of French Indochina focused on the production of raw materials for export to France and other international markets, following the classic colonial pattern of extractive economics. Rice cultivation in the Mekong Delta, rubber plantations, coal mining, and other extractive industries formed the backbone of the colonial economy, generating profits for French companies while providing little benefit to local populations. French companies invested heavily in infrastructure projects including railways, ports, and irrigation systems that facilitated the extraction and export of colonial products, creating transportation networks that served colonial rather than local needs. The social impact of French colonialism in Indochina was profound and far-reaching, transforming traditional Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Laotian societies in ways that would have lasting consequences. The colonial administration introduced French educational systems, legal codes, and administrative practices that transformed traditional Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Laotian societies, creating new educated elites who were trained in French language and culture, but often remained excluded from positions of real authority. At the same time, colonial policies created new social hierarchies and economic relationships that benefited French interests while often disadvantaging local populations, particularly peasant farmers who were subjected to heavy taxation and forced labor requirements. The period from 1870 to 1914 marked the height of French imperial expansion and the creation of the world's second largest colonial empire, as France sought to compensate for its defeat in the Franco-Prussian War through overseas conquest. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871 had demonstrated French military weaknesses in Europe and resulted in the loss of Alsace-Lorraine to Germany, leading many French leaders to see colonial expansion as a way to restore national prestige and power while providing new sources of wealth and strategic advantage. The Third Republic that emerged after the war became strongly committed to imperial expansion as both an economic opportunity and a patriotic duty, viewing colonial conquest as essential for France's survival as a great power. The scramble for Africa during the last quarter of the 19th century saw France acquire vast territories across West and Central Africa in competition with other European powers, particularly Britain and Germany. French explorers, missionaries, and military officers established French control over territories that would eventually become Senegal, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad, Central African Republic, Republic of Congo, Gabon, and parts of other African countries, creating a vast colonial empire that stretched across the continent. This expansion was often accomplished through treaties with local rulers who were pressured or deceived into accepting French protection. But it also involved military campaigns against African states that resisted French domination and sought to maintain their independence. The French approach to African colonization emphasized the concept of assimilation, the idea that colonial subjects could eventually become French citizens through education and cultural transformation, distinguishing French colonial ideology from other European approaches. This policy distinguished French colonialism from British approaches that tended to emphasize indirect rule through traditional authorities, though the reality of French colonial practice often fell short of assimilationist ideals. However, the reality of French colonial practice often fell short of assimilationist ideals, as discriminatory laws and policies maintained clear distinctions between French citizens and colonial subjects, while providing few opportunities for genuine advancement or political participation. The economic exploitation of French Africa focused on the extraction of raw materials and agricultural products for export to France, following patterns established in other French colonies. Groundnut production in Senegal, cotton cultivation in Mali, timber extraction in Gabon, and mining operations throughout the region generated profits for French companies, while providing little benefit to local populations who were often forced to work under harsh conditions for minimal wages. The colonial administration also imposed forced labor requirements and head taxes that compelled Africans to work in colonial enterprises or migrate to areas where wage labor was available, disrupting traditional economic and social systems. The cultural impact of French colonialism in Africa was complex and contradictory, reflecting the tensions between assimilationist ideology and colonial practice. French colonial ideology emphasized the civilizing mission, the belief that French culture and institutions represented universal values that would benefit colonial populations by lifting them from supposed barbarism to civilization. French schools, legal systems, and administrative practices were introduced throughout French Africa, creating new educated elites who were trained in French language and culture, but often found themselves caught between French and African identities. However, the civilizing mission also involved the systematic suppression of African languages, religions, and cultural practices that were dismissed as primitive or backward by colonial administrators. Traditional political structures were often dismantled or subordinated to French administrative control, while African art, music, and literature were dismissed as primitive or backward, creating lasting damage to African cultural traditions. These policies created lasting tensions between French colonial ideals and African cultural identities that would influence independence movements and post-colonial relationships, as educated Africans struggled to reconcile their French education with their African heritage. The First World War marked a crucial turning point in the history of French colonialism, demonstrating both the military value of colonial resources and the growing political consciousness of colonial populations. The war demonstrated both the military value of colonial troops and the growing political consciousness of colonial populations who began to question why they should fight for French freedom while remaining subjects rather than citizens. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers from French colonies fought in European trenches, experiencing unprecedented casualties while gaining new perspectives on French society and European politics. While colonial territories provided crucial raw materials and financial resources for the French war effort, the participation of colonial soldiers in the First World War had profound implications for colonial relationships that would become apparent in the following decades. Veterans returned to their home territories with new experiences of French society and new expectations about their rights and status within the French Empire, having seen French civilians and soldiers in circumstances that challenged colonial stereotypes about European superiority. At the same time, the enormous sacrifices made by colonial populations during the war created moral obligations that complicated traditional colonial relationships, as it became difficult to justify continued political exclusion of people who had died for France. The interwar period saw growing tensions within the French colonial empire as educated colonial elites began to challenge the assumptions and practices of colonial rule with increasing sophistication and organization. The development of nationalist movements in Indochina, the emergence of Pan-African political organizations, and the growth of independence movements throughout the French Empire reflected changing political consciousness and rising expectations among colonial populations who had been exposed to new ideas about democracy and self-determination. These movements were often led by colonial subjects who had been educated in French schools and universities, creating the ironic situation where French education produced the leaders of anti-colonial resistance. The economic impact of the Great Depression during the 1930s created additional strains within the French colonial system, as falling commodity prices reduced colonial revenues while increasing the costs of maintaining colonial administration and security. These economic pressures led to increased exploitation of colonial resources and labor, which in turn fueled growing opposition to colonial rule among populations that were already suffering from economic hardship. The Depression also weakened France's ability to invest in colonial development or make concessions to colonial demands, creating a vicious cycle that undermined colonial stability. The Second World War brought the French colonial empire to the brink of collapse by exposing the weaknesses of French military power and creating new opportunities for independence movements. The German conquest of France in 1940 created a crisis of legitimacy that split the colonial empire between supporters of the Vichy government and followers of Charles de Gaulle's Free French movement, weakening French control and creating opportunities for local populations to assert greater autonomy. This division weakened French control over colonial territories while providing opportunities for independence movements to organize and gain international support from Allied powers that were increasingly opposed to European colonialism. The Japanese conquest of French Indochina demonstrated the vulnerability of European colonial empires to Asian military power and shattered assumptions about European racial superiority that had justified colonial rule. The ease with which Japanese forces defeated French colonial troops shattered the myth of European invincibility and encouraged independence movements throughout Asia and Africa to believe that European colonial rule could be successfully challenged. The Japanese occupation also disrupted colonial economic systems and administrative structures in ways that would make it difficult to restore effective French control after the war. While Japanese propaganda about Asian liberation from European domination found receptive audiences throughout the colonial world, the liberation of France in 1944 did not restore the French colonial empire to its pre-war status, as the war had fundamentally altered both international politics and colonial societies. The war had fundamentally altered the international balance of power, creating new superpowers in the United States and Soviet Union that were generally opposed to European colonialism for both ideological and strategic reasons. At the same time, the United Nations Charter and other international agreements established new principles of self-determination that challenged the legitimacy of colonial rule and provided legal and moral support for independence movements. The immediate post-war period saw French attempts to restore colonial control through a combination of political reforms and military force that ultimately proved unsuccessful. The French Union, established in 1946, was designed to transform the colonial empire into a voluntary association of autonomous territories linked to France through common institutions and shared citizenship, offering limited self-government while maintaining French control over key policies. However, these reforms failed to satisfy growing demands for independence, while creating new contradictions within the colonial system that made effective governance increasingly difficult. The First Indochina War began in 1946 when negotiations between French officials and Vietnamese nationalist leader Ho Chi Minh broke down over the question of Vietnamese independence and the extent of French control over Indochinese affairs. The war quickly escalated into a major conflict that would consume enormous French resources and ultimately end in French defeat at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, demonstrating that even a major European power could be defeated by a determined independence movement with popular support. The loss of Indochina was a devastating blow to French prestige and marked the beginning of the end for the French colonial empire, showing that military force alone could not maintain colonial control against popular opposition. The Algerian War of Independence, which began in 1954, posed an even greater challenge to French colonial rule because of Algeria's unique legal and political status within the French Republic. Unlike Indochina, which had always been clearly recognized as a colony, Algeria was legally considered an integral part of France, with 3 departments that sent representatives to the French Parliament and were supposed to be governed by the same laws as metropolitan France. The Algerian independence movement therefore challenged not just French colonial policy, but the territorial integrity of the French Republic itself, making compromise much more difficult to achieve. The Front de Libération Nationale, or FLN, launched its rebellion against French rule with coordinated attacks throughout Algeria on November 1, 1954, beginning what would become one of the most brutal decolonization conflicts of the 20th century. The organization had learned important lessons from the Indochina conflict and other decolonization struggles, developing sophisticated political and military strategies that proved highly effective against French forces despite their superior equipment and training. The FLN combined guerrilla warfare with political organization and international diplomacy, seeking to make French rule impossible while building support for Algerian independence, both domestically and internationally. The French response to the Algerian rebellion involved the deployment of hundreds of thousands of troops and the implementation of increasingly harsh counterinsurgency measures that violated fundamental principles of French republican government. French forces employed torture, collective punishment, and forced resettlement in efforts to defeat the independence movement, using methods that shocked French public opinion and undermined support for the war effort. These tactics achieved some military success, but at enormous political and moral costs that ultimately undermined French resolve to continue the conflict, as French society struggled to reconcile republican ideals with colonial practices. The Algerian War created deep divisions within French society and politics that threatened the stability of the Fourth Republic and raised fundamental questions about French national identity. The conflict raised fundamental questions about French identity, democratic values, and the future of the French Republic, as the use of torture and other brutal methods contradicted the principles on which French democracy was supposedly based. The use of torture by French forces sparked intense debates about the compatibility of republican ideals with colonial practices, while the costs of the war strained French finances and diverted resources from domestic development projects that were needed for post-war reconstruction. The crisis reached its peak in 1958 when military officers and settlers in Algeria attempted to overthrow the French government rather than accept any compromise on Algerian independence, threatening France with civil war. The threat of civil war brought Charles de Gaulle back to power as the last leader capable of resolving the Algerian crisis through his unique prestige and political skills. However, de Gaulle's solution involved accepting Algerian independence, a decision that many of his supporters found difficult to accept, and that led to the formation of the Secret Army Organization, which conducted a terrorist campaign against both French and Algerian targets. The Evian Accords signed in March 1962 ended the Algerian War and granted independence to Algeria, bringing to a close one of the most traumatic episodes in French history. The agreement included provisions for protecting the rights of European settlers and maintaining French economic interests. But these arrangements quickly broke down as hundreds of thousands of Pieds Noirs fled to France and the new Algerian government nationalized French properties. The exodus of European settlers created enormous social and economic problems in France while eliminating the settler population that had been the main constituency for continued French rule in Algeria. The end of the Algerian War marked the effective end of the French colonial empire, eliminating the last major colonial territory and ending France's status as a global imperial power. While France retained control over some small territories in the Caribbean, Pacific, and Indian Ocean, the loss of Algeria eliminated the last major colonial territory and ended France's status as a global imperial power, forcing France to redefine its international role and domestic priorities. The human and economic costs of decolonization were enormous, with millions of people displaced from their homes and billions of francs spent on military campaigns that ultimately failed to preserve French control, leaving France to confront the psychological and political challenges of adjusting to its reduced international status. The process of decolonization in French Africa was generally less violent than the wars in Indochina and Algeria, but it still involved significant challenges and conflicts as newly independent states struggled to establish effective governance and economic viability. The Loi Cadre of 1956 granted greater autonomy to French African territories, while the constitutional referendum of 1958 offered African territories the choice between independence and membership in the French community, a new form of association that promised continued French support in exchange for limited sovereignty. Most territories chose independence, though they maintained close economic and political ties to France through various cooperation agreements that preserved many aspects of the colonial relationship. The transition to independence in French Africa was complicated by the artificial nature of colonial boundaries and the weakness of newly independent states that lacked the administrative capacity and economic resources necessary for effective governance. Many of the new nations lacked the administrative capacity, economic resources, and political unity necessary for effective governance, having been created by colonial boundaries that ignored ethnic, linguistic, and cultural divisions. France maintained significant influence through military bases, economic agreements, and political interventions that critics described as neocolonialism, suggesting that independence had changed the form but not the substance of French domination. The end of French colonial rule in sub-Saharan Africa also involved the establishment of the CFA franc zone, a monetary system that linked the currencies of former French colonies to the French franc and later to the euro. This arrangement provided monetary stability, but also maintained French economic influence and limited the monetary sovereignty of African nations, creating ongoing debates about whether the CFA franc system represents a form of continued colonial exploitation or a mutually beneficial economic arrangement. The decolonization of French territories in the Caribbean and Pacific followed different patterns, reflecting their smaller size and strategic importance to France as well as local preferences for continued association with France. Territories like Martinique, Guadeloupe, French Guiana, and New Caledonia became overseas departments or collectivities with varying degrees of autonomy while remaining part of the French Republic, enjoying French citizenship and social benefits while maintaining distinct cultural identities. These arrangements reflected both local preferences and French strategic interests in maintaining a global presence and demonstrated that decolonization could take forms other than complete independence. The legacy of French colonialism continues to influence international relations and domestic politics in both France and its former colonies in ways that ensure its continued relevance for understanding contemporary global politics. The economic relationships established during the colonial period persist through trade agreements, investment patterns, and development aid programs that maintain French influence in Africa and other regions, while cultural connections created by colonial education and language policies continue to shape international relationships. French military interventions in Chad, Ivory Coast, Mali, and other former colonies demonstrate the continued importance of these relationships for French foreign policy and the ongoing relevance of colonial history for understanding contemporary conflicts. The cultural impact of French colonialism is equally significant and complex, creating lasting connections that continue to influence both French and former colonial societies. The spread of French language, educational systems, and cultural practices created lasting connections between France and its former colonies, but it also involved the suppression of local languages and cultures that continues to generate resentment and conflict among populations that lost important aspects of their cultural heritage. The question of how to address the historical injustices of colonialism remains a contentious issue in French politics and international relations, with ongoing debates about reparations, apologies, and the teaching of colonial history in French schools. The immigration of people from former French colonies to France has created new challenges and opportunities for French society that reflect the ongoing consequences of colonial history. The presence of large communities from North Africa, West Africa, and the Caribbean has enriched French culture, while also creating tensions around questions of integration, identity, and citizenship that reflect unresolved issues from the colonial period. The riots in French suburbs during 2005 highlighted the ongoing difficulties faced by immigrants and their descendants in achieving full participation in French society. suggesting that the legacy of colonial racial hierarchies continues to influence contemporary French social relations. The memory of French colonialism continues to shape political debates and cultural expressions in both France and its former colonies, influencing everything from educational curricula to political campaigns. In France, there are ongoing discussions about how to teach colonial history in schools, whether to apologize for colonial crimes, and how to address the continuing effects of colonial relationships on contemporary French society. These debates reflect broader questions about French national identity and the country's role in the contemporary world, as France struggles to define itself as a post-colonial power while maintaining significant global influence and responsibilities. In former French colonies, the legacy of colonialism influences everything from political institutions and legal systems to language policies and cultural practices, creating ongoing challenges for post-colonial development. The challenge of building viable nation-states from colonial territories with artificial boundaries remains a central issue in many African countries, while the relationship with France continues to be a source of both opportunity and controversy as former colonies seek to balance the benefits of continued French support with the desire for genuine independence and self-determination. The end of the French colonial empire thus represents not just the conclusion of a historical period, but the beginning of new relationships and challenges that continue to evolve and influence contemporary global politics. The transformation from colonial empire to post-colonial partnership has been neither complete nor entirely successful, as evidenced by ongoing conflicts, economic dependencies, and cultural tensions that reflect the unresolved contradictions of the colonial experience. Understanding this complex legacy is essential for comprehending both French history and the contemporary dynamics of global politics and economics, as the effects of colonialism continue to shape international relationships and domestic policies in both France and its former colonies. The story of French colonialism from 1763 to 1962 is ultimately a story of adaptation, resistance, and transformation that reveals the complex dynamics of power, culture, and identity in the modern world. The French Empire that emerged after the 7 Years' War was different from its predecessor, shaped by revolutionary ideologies, industrial capitalism, and new forms of racial thinking that justified European domination over non-European peoples. The empire that collapsed in the 1960s was different again, undermined by world wars, decolonization movements, and changing international norms about sovereignty and human rights that made colonial rule increasingly difficult to justify or maintain. Throughout this long history, the relationship between metropolitan France and its colonies was never simply one of domination and exploitation, but involved complex negotiations and interactions that produced diverse outcomes. French colonial rule involved complex negotiations between colonial administrators and local populations, between settler communities and indigenous peoples, between economic interests and political ideologies that created different colonial experiences in different times and places. The outcomes of these negotiations varied enormously across time and space, creating diverse colonial experiences that defy simple generalizations while revealing common patterns of resistance, adaptation, and transformation. The ultimate failure of French efforts to maintain colonial control reflects both the internal contradictions of colonial ideology and the growing strength of independence movements that successfully challenged European domination. The promise of assimilation and the civilizing mission created expectations that colonial practice could never fulfill, while the development of educated colonial elites provided leadership for independence movements that could articulate alternative visions of political and social organization. The costs of maintaining colonial control through military force ultimately exceeded the benefits that France derived from colonial relationships, making decolonization inevitable even if its specific timing and character remained contested. The end of the French colonial empire marked the conclusion of one of the most significant chapters in modern world history, bringing to a close more than 4 centuries of French overseas expansion and colonial rule. For more than 4 centuries, French explorers, merchants, missionaries, and administrators had played crucial roles in creating the global connections and cultural exchanges that characterize the modern world, leaving lasting legacies that continue to influence contemporary politics, economics, and culture. The legacy of this imperial experience continues to influence contemporary politics, economics, and culture in ways that ensure its continued relevance for understanding our interconnected world and the ongoing challenges of building more just and equitable international relationships.